I'm a 33-year-old woman, married to my husband, who's 35, for 6 years now. If I had to sum up our marriage, I'd say it's been a roller coaster of highs and lows. At first, it felt like I was living my dream life. My husband has always been financially secure, earning significantly more than me. He had this air of stability and confidence that was magnetic. But over time, I started to notice patterns in his behavior that I can't unsee anymore. Whenever we argued, he had a favorite weapon: divorce. It wasn't outright yelling or insults, just calm, cutting phrases like, "Maybe we're not compatible," or "If you don't like it, we can get divorced." He'd say these things almost casually, but they landed like a ton of bricks. In the early years, I'd panic. The thought of my marriage falling apart made me feel like a failure, so I'd backtrack, apologize, and try to smooth things over. It was like walking on eggshells, always trying to avoid triggering those words. Looking back, I realize he used those threats to shut down any serious conversations about things that mattered to me, whether it was about shared responsibilities, financial decisions, or even how we spent our weekends. He had this way of ending the discussion by dangling the possibility of a divorce over my head. It left me feeling small, powerless, and like I had to constantly prove my worth in the marriage. Things started shifting about 2 years ago, when my best friend, she's 32, and we've been close since college, pointed out something I hadn't let myself admit. She told me that his threats weren't just hurtful, they were manipulative. She said it plainly. He wasn't just frustrated during arguments, he was controlling the narrative. It was like a light bulb went off in my head. For years, I thought I just wasn't trying hard enough to make our marriage work. But the truth was, he had no intention of meeting me halfway. He was using his financial position and those threats to keep me in line. That realization was a turning point. I started taking small, quiet steps to protect myself. I opened a separate savings account that he doesn't know about. At first, it felt sneaky, but then I reminded myself that it wasn't about hiding money. It was about having a safety net. I didn't know what I'd do with it, but I knew I needed options. Last year, I got a promotion at work, and you'd think he'd be happy for me. Instead, he acted like it was a personal attack. He started making little comments about how I was getting too independent or focusing too much on my career. It was subtle at first, but it escalated. He'd roll his eyes when I talked about work and dismiss my achievements like they didn't matter. I tried ignoring it, but it was obvious he didn't like that I was coming into my own professionally. For someone who constantly reminded me of how financially secure he was, it was strange how threatened he seemed by my success. The tipping point came a few months ago when I told him I'd be going on a week-long work trip. It was an important opportunity for me and I was excited about it, but when I brought it up, his response was cold and sharp. He told me that if I cared about our marriage, I'd cancel the trip. I refused, and that's when he dropped it again. If this is how you want to prioritize your life, maybe we're not meant to be together. That was it for me. Something inside me snapped. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I just stared at him and nodded. In that moment, I decided I was done being controlled. If he wanted to play the divorce card, fine. I'd call his bluff. I started planning carefully, knowing I'd need to be smart about how I handled this. I began looking into our finances, not just to understand what we had, but to figure out what he might be hiding. Over the years, he'd always been vague about money, and I realized I'd been content to let him handle most of it. That changed. I started pulling records, reviewing bank statements, and making notes. It didn't take long to see there were gaps in what he'd told me. One night, while he was asleep, I found documents on his laptop that raised even more questions. There were payments going toward a property I didn't know existed, and it didn't add up with what he'd told me about his earnings. It was like peeling back layers of a secret life he'd been keeping from me. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I kept quiet, gathering every piece of information I could. I confided in my best friend, who reminded me to stay calm and strategic. She encouraged me to consult a lawyer, which I did. That meeting was an eye-opener. The lawyer told me that if he initiated a divorce, his financial situation might not hold up under scrutiny. I had more leverage than I thought, and it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. The more I uncovered, the more I realized he wasn't as untouchable as he made himself out to be. His threats of divorce had always been about power, but now I could see the cracks in his facade. And for the first time, I felt like I had a way to push back. I'm not someone who likes conflict, but I also can't keep living like this. I love my career, my independence, and the life I've worked so hard to build. Staying with him feels unbearable, but I know leaving won't be easy. I've made up my mind, though. I'm done letting him control the narrative. This time I'm taking the reins. Let's see how he handles it when the tables turn. The first thing I did was start going through our shared bank statements. I had access to them, but I'd never really looked before. He always handled the finances, and I trusted him. But now I was noticing things I'd ignored for years. It didn't take long to see that something wasn't adding up. There were large transfers going to an account I didn't recognize. I also found recurring payments to what seemed like a loan company, but we didn't have any loans, or so I thought. I spent hours piecing it together. There was a property listed in some of the payments, a condo I had never heard about. The payments weren't small either. They were enough to suggest this wasn't just a vacation rental or investment. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I casually started bringing up finances in conversation. I mentioned how stressful it was managing my new salary and budgeting, hoping he'd take the bait. His reaction was immediate. He tensed up and deflected. He brushed it off, saying I didn't need to worry about that stuff because he had everything under control. That was my confirmation. He was hiding something. I knew I had to be careful, so I played along. Whenever he complained about how my promotion was making me too independent, I'd agree and downplay my career. I acted like I was backing down, but in reality, I was gathering more information. I started going through old emails and documents. That's when I found even more details about the condo. It wasn't just an investment, it was losing money. He had rented it out, but it wasn't covering the mortgage. The tenants had left months ago, and he was paying for it out of pocket. At this point, I needed advice, so I told my best friend everything. She wasn't surprised. She said it made sense that he was trying to keep me in the dark about his finances because it gave him control. She encouraged me to talk to a lawyer, just to understand my options. I made an appointment the next day. The lawyer was blunt. If he filed for divorce, he'd be in serious trouble financially. His debts, the condo, and the fact that I'd been contributing more than I realized to our shared expenses could all work in my favor. Armed with this information, I decided to wait for the right moment. It came sooner than I expected. One evening, we were arguing about household chores, something small, but he escalated it like always. He threw out the usual line about how we might not be compatible. This time, instead of panicking, I brought up the condo. I asked him why we were paying for a property I didn't know about. The look on his face was priceless. He stammered, trying to explain it away as an investment opportunity that didn't pan out. I didn't let it go. I pointed out that this wasn't just a bad investment, it was reckless. He got defensive, saying I didn't understand how these things worked. I told him that was exactly the problem. I didn't understand because he'd never been honest with me. For the first time in years, I wasn't backing down, and he knew it. His usual tactic of shutting me up with divorce threats didn't work. He realized he was cornered. That night, I packed a bag and told him I needed time to think. I didn't tell him where I was going, but I stayed with my best friend. Over the next few days, he called and texted constantly, asking to talk. He said he'd explain everything if I came home, but I wasn't ready to face him yet. Instead, I used the time to keep digging. I found more loans in his name, along with credit card debts I hadn't known about. It became clear that he was over-leveraged and barely holding it together. It was almost ironic. He'd always acted like he was the financially stable one, using his income as leverage to keep me in line. But now, I could see that the foundation he'd built his control on was shaky at best. I felt a strange sense of relief. For years, I thought he held all the power in our marriage, but now I realized he was just as vulnerable as anyone else. By the end of the week, I was ready to face him. I still hadn't decided what my next move would be, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let him control the narrative anymore. When I returned home, he was waiting for me, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He tried to act like everything was fine, but it was clear he was shaken. He asked me to sit down so we could talk, but I told him I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I told him I needed full transparency. I wanted to know everything about his finances, the condo, and the debts. He hesitated, trying to downplay it all again, but I wasn't buying it. I told him I wasn't going to sweep this under the rug. The days of ignoring his behavior were over. He didn't know how to respond, and I could tell he was panicking. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I had the upper hand. He kept asking if I was serious about leaving, and I didn't give him a straight answer. I let him sit with the uncertainty, just like he'd done to me for years. As the calls and texts continued, I could tell he was desperate to fix things, but only on his terms. This time, I wasn't going to let that happen. The next phase of my plan was already forming in my mind, and I knew exactly how to execute it. When I went back home, I made a conscious decision to act like I was reconsidering everything. I let him talk, offering half-hearted nods as he rambled about how things had gotten out of hand and how he wanted to make things right. He tried throwing in the usual lines about how he'd always been the provider and how he just wanted us to be partners. I acted like I was taking it all in, even suggesting that maybe we could rebuild trust by being completely open about our finances. He hesitated for a moment before reluctantly agreeing. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He didn't want to share the full picture. Still, he started pulling up documents and accounts, probably assuming I wouldn't understand most of it. What he didn't realize was that I'd already been digging. This was my chance to fill in the gaps. I let him explain things in his own words, casually asking questions here and there, acting like I was just trying to understand. It didn't take long for me to piece everything together. The condo was, in fact, a rental unit, but it had been empty for months. The tenants had left after filing complaints about maintenance issues he never addressed. Meanwhile, he'd been sinking thousands of dollars into keeping it afloat. It wasn't an investment, it was a black hole. I brought up the idea of selling it to cut our losses, framing it as a way to start fresh. His reaction was explosive. He accused me of not understanding his vision, of not appreciating the work he'd put into it. That outburst told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about the condo or the money, it was about his pride. He didn't want to admit he'd made a mistake, even if it meant dragging both of us down with him. I let him rant, pretending to back off, but inside, my resolve was growing stronger. If he wanted to keep his illusions intact, fine. I had my own plans. Over the next few weeks, I started making small changes. I began quietly withdrawing money from our joint accounts and moving it into my separate savings. Nothing too noticeable, just enough that if he checked, it wouldn't raise any red flags. At the same time, I started talking to a realtor about the house. I framed it as casual curiosity, saying I wanted to know its value in case we ever decided to sell. The realtor's appraisal confirmed what I suspected. The house was worth significantly more than what we owed on it. Selling it could wipe out a large chunk of his debts, but I kept that information to myself. If he thought he had all the power, I wanted him to keep believing that, for now. The first time I brought up divorce, it was during another minor argument. He'd started complaining again about how my promotion was taking too much of my time. Instead of defending myself, I just shrugged and said, "Maybe we're not meant to be together." The look on his face was almost comical. For years, he'd been the one throwing around that threat, but hearing it from me caught him completely off guard. He went quiet, probably trying to figure out if I was serious. After that, I noticed a shift in his behavior. He started treating me more cautiously, like he was walking on eggshells. He even tried being more supportive, asking about my work and offering to help around the house. I played along, pretending to appreciate his efforts, but I knew it wasn't genuine. He wasn't changing because he wanted to. He was changing because he was scared. Behind the scenes, I began laying the groundwork for what came next. I started dropping little bits of information to mutual friends, painting myself as the rational, supportive spouse. I didn't say anything outright about his debts or the condo, but I hinted at the stress of balancing everything while he pursued investments. It wasn't hard to frame myself as the one holding everything together. People started reaching out, offering support, which only made my husband look more isolated. I also started feeding into his ego, agreeing with some of his ideas and making him think I was back on his side. It kept him off balance, unsure of where I stood. Meanwhile, I continued working with the realtor, quietly exploring the logistics of selling the house. I learned that if he were the one to initiate a divorce, the financial strain would be overwhelming for him. He didn't have the resources to handle it, especially with all his debts and the sinking condo. By the time he started noticing the cracks in his confidence, it was too late for him to regain control. He'd gone from acting like the dominant partner to nervously checking in with me, asking if we were okay. One night, after a tense conversation about the condo, he finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "You're not actually thinking about divorce, are you?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I gave him the same vague response he'd given me for years. "I don't know. Maybe we need to figure out what's best for both of us." His face fell, and for the first time in our marriage, he looked genuinely unsure of himself. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment to spring it. When I finally decided to bring up divorce again, I didn't do it during an argument or heated discussion. I chose a quiet evening when we were sitting in the living room. I told him calmly that I thought it was time to talk about what a divorce might look like. His reaction was immediate, his face froze, and for a second, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he started scrambling, asking where this was coming from and why I was bringing it up now. I stayed composed and said that I wanted to approach things practically, considering everything we'd been through. I added that before any decisions could be made, I needed full transparency about our finances. He hesitated, trying to brush it off as unnecessary, but I didn't let it slide. I told him I wouldn't move forward without seeing everything: bank accounts, loans, debts, the condo. His hesitation grew into full-blown defensiveness. He tried turning it back on me, accusing me of being the one who was hiding things or not appreciating how much he'd done for us. Instead of arguing, I calmly pointed out that he'd been the one bringing up divorce for years. I reminded him that he'd always said if I wasn't happy, I could leave. Now that I was taking his words seriously, he seemed to have a problem with it. That shut him up, but I could see the gears turning in his head. He was realizing I wasn't playing along anymore. Over the next few days, I kept setting clear boundaries. Whenever he tried to guilt me or twist my words, I stopped him. I didn't raise my voice or let him drag me into emotional debates. I just stated what I needed and refused to budge. The more serious I became, the more desperate he got. He started bringing up our history together, saying he didn't want to lose me and that we could fix things. I dropped a subtle bomb during one of these conversations. I casually mentioned that, given his debts and the state of the condo, a divorce might not be the worst outcome for me financially. The color drained from his face. For years, he'd operated under the assumption that he held all the power in our relationship, but now he was seeing the cracks. As I continued gathering evidence and preparing for what might come next, I brought in my lawyer to discuss potential terms. This wasn't a formal meeting with him present, just me ensuring I had all my bases covered. My lawyer confirmed what I suspected. If it came down to it, I could walk away from this marriage without being financially destroyed. In fact, I'd likely come out ahead because of how much he'd been relying on my contributions to keep things afloat. Around this time, he started panicking. He begged me for a second chance, promising to change and do better. I didn't reject him outright. Instead, I told him I needed time to think, which kept him on edge. It also gave me space to continue building my case and strengthening my position. I started documenting everything: text messages, bank statements, even conversations where he admitted to making poor financial decisions. One thing I noticed was that he completely stopped using divorce as a weapon. For the first time in years, he wasn't throwing those words around to shut me down. Instead, he seemed almost afraid to mention it, as if saying it aloud would make it real. His behavior became more cautious, more careful. He started tiptoeing around me, trying to gauge where I stood. Meanwhile, I started hearing from mutual friends who'd picked up on the shift in our dynamic. They reached out to check on me, some even commenting on how impressed they were that I was standing up for myself. It became clear that he wasn't just losing control at home, he was losing the narrative he'd tried to maintain with the people around us. With everything lined up, I began planning my final move. I wasn't rushing into anything, but I wanted to be prepared for any outcome. I revisited the idea of selling the house, quietly exploring how that might play out if I decided to leave. I also started considering how I'd divide up our shared assets and what I'd need to do to ensure a clean break. One night, as we were sitting at the dining table, he finally broke. He looked at me, his voice shaky, and asked the question I'd been waiting for: "What do you want from me?" It wasn't an accusation or a challenge, it was genuine fear. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence linger, knowing he was grappling with the realization that he no longer had the upper hand. For years, he'd been the one calling the shots, but now, the power dynamic had shifted entirely. And this time, I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. The night after he asked me, "What do you want from me?" I knew it was time to lay all my cards on the table. I had spent months gathering evidence, lining up everything I needed to ensure I wasn't blindsided. I sat him down in the dining room, spread out the documents I had collected, and told him we were going to go through everything. He looked pale but didn't argue. I started with the condo, showing him the payments, the maintenance complaints, and the financial losses he had been hiding. From there, I moved on to the credit card debts, the personal loans, and the fact that he had been using my income to supplement his poor financial decisions without ever discussing it with me. As I laid everything out, his usual defensiveness crumbled. He didn't try to deny it or shift the blame. He just sat there staring at the table. When I finished, I told him I'd been consulting a lawyer. That got his attention. I made it clear that I wasn't bluffing and that I had already started making plans to leave. His head snapped up, and for the first time I saw genuine panic in his eyes. He begged me not to go. He promised to fix everything, to sell the condo, to do whatever it took to make things right. But I didn't let his desperation sway me. I pointed out that his manipulative behavior and constant threats had destroyed our marriage long before I started digging into his finances. I told him I wasn't interested in empty promises anymore. If he wanted a chance to rebuild this marriage, he was going to have to prove it. That's when I brought up the postnuptial agreement. I explained that it would legally protect me if he ever reverted to his old ways. He looked horrified, but he didn't argue. He knew he didn't have a choice. He agreed to sign it, desperate to salvage whatever was left of our relationship. Once the paperwork was in motion, I took control of our finances. I set up a strict budget, moved our remaining joint funds into an account I managed, and began selling off the condo. It wasn't easy. There was damage to the property that had to be fixed before it could go on the market, and the real estate agent warned us it might take months to sell. But I didn't care. I was determined to get rid of it, even if it meant taking a small loss. As the weeks went by, I noticed a shift in our dynamic. He stopped trying to control the narrative and started walking on eggshells around me. He asked before making any financial decisions, checked in about household matters, and even started helping out more without being asked. It wasn't lost on me that his change in behavior was fueled by fear rather than genuine growth, but I wasn't going to let that stop me from setting new boundaries. I started focusing on myself again, something I hadn't done in years. I threw myself into my career, took on new projects, and even began reconnecting with friends I had distanced myself from during the worst years of our marriage. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel trapped. I didn't feel like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next blow. The condo eventually sold, and we used the proceeds to pay off a significant portion of his debts. I refused to let him touch the rest of the money. Instead, I funneled it into savings accounts I controlled, ensuring that we'd have a financial cushion moving forward. He didn't argue. He knew better than to push back at this point. The power dynamic between us had shifted completely. Where he had once been the one holding all the cards, I was now firmly in control. He became more attentive, more cautious, almost as if he was afraid of losing me for good. It was a stark contrast to the man who had once casually threatened divorce whenever he wanted to shut me down. One evening, as I was wrapping up some work in the living room, he came in and sat down across from me. He looked nervous, like he was about to say something important. After a moment of silence, he finally asked, "How can I make this right?" For a second, I just stared at him, trying to decide how to respond. The truth was, I didn't know if he could make it right. So much had been broken, and while I had regained my independence and sense of self, I wasn't sure if I could ever fully trust him again. Instead of giving him an answer, I told him I'd need time. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't ready to forget, but for now I was content with the way things had shifted. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't the one walking on eggshells, and I intended to keep it that way. In the months that followed the signing of the postnuptial agreement and the sale of the condo, things settled into a new kind of normal. My husband's behavior was almost unrecognizable from the man I had been married to for 6 years. He was attentive, careful with his words, and surprisingly respectful of the boundaries I had set. For example, he stopped making comments about my career or independence, something that used to be a constant source of tension between us. If anything, he went out of his way to show support, asking about my projects and even encouraging me to take on new opportunities. But I wasn't naive. I knew that fear and guilt were driving his actions, not necessarily genuine change. That's why I stayed cautious. I kept my personal savings intact and maintained full control over our shared finances. Every time he tried to initiate a conversation about sharing responsibilities again, I redirected it back to the systems I had already put in place. I wasn't going to give him a chance to make reckless decisions again, no matter how much he insisted he'd learned his lesson. His financial situation continued to be a struggle, but I made it clear that I wasn't going to fix it for him. He still had debts to pay off, and without the rental property draining money, he was slowly digging himself out of the hole. However, I drew a firm line. I wouldn't contribute to paying off his mistakes. If he wanted to rebuild his finances, he'd have to do it on his own. Meanwhile, I started rebuilding parts of my life that I had let fall apart during the marriage. I reconnected with old friends, some of whom I hadn't seen in years. It was strange at first, trying to explain why I had been so distant, but most of them understood. They didn't press for details, and instead they welcomed me back with open arms. I started going out more, meeting for coffee, attending social events, and even taking a weekend trip with my best friend. Through all of this, I reflected on how much I had learned about power and control in relationships. For years, I had been so focused on making my marriage work that I hadn't realized how much I was losing myself in the process. Now, I could see things clearly. His constant threats of divorce hadn't just been hurtful, they had been a way to keep me dependent on him. But the irony was that his threats had backfired, forcing me to take control of my life, and ultimately, the relationship. I started considering my options for the future. The postnuptial agreement gave me a sense of security, knowing that if things ever went south again, I could walk away without hesitation. But for now, I decided to stay and see if this new dynamic could work. He was finally taking responsibility for his actions, albeit reluctantly, and I wanted to give him the opportunity to prove himself. One evening, we sat down to talk about what was next for us. I suggested that we try counseling, not therapy, but counseling that would focus on communication and boundaries. He wasn't thrilled about the idea, but he agreed. I told him that this was non-negotiable if we wanted to rebuild our marriage. The sessions were awkward at first, but they helped us navigate our new roles as equals. For the first time, I felt like my voice was being heard without fear of retaliation or manipulation. I also started seeing myself differently. I I was no longer intimidated by his financial status or the way he had always framed himself as the provider. I was finally seeing myself as an equal partner, someone who could hold her own in every aspect of life. It was empowering, and it gave me a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. As time went on, I noticed subtle changes in him. He was still cautious, but he seemed genuinely invested in making things work. He stopped making excuses for his past behavior and started acknowledging the damage he had caused. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And while I appreciated the effort, I kept my guard up. I wasn't going to let my boundaries slip, no matter how much he tried to prove himself. Every now and then, I would catch myself wondering what the future might look like, whether we would stay together or eventually go our separate ways. For now, I was content with the way things were. I had regained my independence, rebuilt my confidence, and learned how to stand up for myself. Whatever happened next, I knew I would be okay. One night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he looked at me and asked, "Do you think things will ever go back to how they were?" I stopped what I was doing and thought about it for a moment before answering. I told him, "I hope not." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant. This wasn't about going back, it was about moving forward. And whether we moved forward together or apart, I knew one thing for sure: I would never let myself feel powerless again.